It turns out that the Game of Thrones is not all that much easier to play if you have dragons, especially when the people with dragons can't agree which one of them gets it. HBO's blockbuster series Game of Thrones is getting the prequel treatment as we get a glimpse of the beginning of the end for House Targaryen, which would eventually give way to the free-for-all that would happen once the Mad King met the pointy end of the Kingslayer. Seems like a good time to dig into how intricate that game got with the details.
When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die.
The Game of Thrones brings out the worst in people, especially people who start out as kinda the worst, like the Beggar King Viserys Targaryen. In exile after his father was overthrown, he had a plan to rectify that, marry his sister off to a Dothraki warlord for his 40,000 strong army. When his sister starts to integrate into the Dothraki, he scoffs that she'd have him braid his hair. She corrects him that having conquered nothing, he can't have a braid. As Daenerys starts to rack up W's though, she starts to add her own braids. Game of Thrones has a pretty high body count in the worst sense of that term, but also in the best sense, but that's kind of its own thing. The man responsible for both kinds of body counts is Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, who runs the brothels among other things in King's Landing. His unrequited love for Catelyn Stark leads him to taking Sansa Stark to Catelyn's home, the Vale, where Baelish pushes his new bride, her sister, through the moon door, because he's awful. He then gives his nephew some life advice about not worrying about dying, huh?
People die at their dinner tables, they die in their beds.
He also happens to tell how Joffrey dies, and predict how Shae and Tywin Lannister die as he lists the places people can die. Stern and not afraid to tell his children exactly how much of a disappointment they are. Lannister plans have plans, and he doesn't trust his children to pull off any of them because the only one smart enough is a dwarf whose birth took his wife. To telegraph his plans, when we first see Tywin, he's skinning a stag, the symbol of the House of Baratheon, the king he's about to unseat. Sigils are big business in Westeros. They're not just things each kingdom has, but their ambitions or practices or principles. A Song of Ice and Fire scribe, George R.R. Martin, gets a sigil in the opening credits. Turtles. And you're thinking, yeah, because he's been so slow to release the last book in his series, leaving the showrunners to their own devices, right? Nope. Turtles were Martin's childhood pets. And you guessed the mean explanation, see? Tisk tisk. Martin isn't the only unseen character to get a sigil that relates to them or their role. In this case, the editor for the episode. They get a pair of crossed swords that resemble a pair of scissors, harking back to a time when everything was shot on film and the editor would literally cut the film together physically. All of the terminology for editing stems from that period of time, with terms like clips and something ending up on the editing room floor where a cutscene would literally end up on the floor. The best kind of secret is the one that the movie or the show put right in front of you and you don't notice until it's too late. Some of that is things like Littlefinger telling his nephew how a bunch of people are gonna die. Another comes when the cinematographer telegraphs who it really is that poisoned Joffrey. When he gets to the part about cursed be who would tear them asunder, the focus rolls off of Joffrey to a smirking Olenna Tyrell, who's about to poison the bratty king. Tywin has an attribute that many super harsh fathers share. They are much, much nicer to their grandkids. When Joffrey's biting the dust in the background, you can see a moment of empathy and, dare I say, basic human kindness as Tywin covers Tommen's innocent eyes from the rather ugly death of his awful big brother. One of the great mysteries that drives Game of Thrones is who exactly are Jon Snow's parents, because it doesn't really seem like Ned Stark is the kind to get some strange while off at war. Turns out that he's a product of the forbidden love between Ned's sister and Rhaegar Targaryen before dying. Knowing that being a Targaryen is not going to be super safe in post-rebellion Westeros, Ned takes the baby home as his bastard child. To foreshadow his House of Dragon lineage, the direwolf that Jon ends up with in the first episode has the Targaryen's notable white hair. With the exception of one glaring blind spot, Jaime Lannister is a relatively good judge of character. He was able to see red flags as long as they weren't being waved by his sister. Like when someone mentions that Theon Greyjoy seems like a good lad, Jaime answers back,
I doubt it.
and he's right. Game of Thrones has a lot of moving pieces. Fortunately for viewers who were paying attention, the opening credits would act like cliff notes for the episode that you were about to watch. And not just by focusing on the cities that will come into play during that episode, you'd also get a glimpse of their condition. In the final episode, we can see through the roof of the Red Keep to the map in the floor with a crack running through it, something we would see in life-size moments later in the episode. All the way back in Season 1, Cersei felt like she was the only conspiracy in town. During Season 1, her kid is on the throne, the husband she hates is dead, she's on top of the world. Someone suggests that the Starks are a bit of an issue. She scoffs, asking, what could Lyanna Stark's ghost do to either of us? Save Westeros, walk the dragon-riding nightmare to the gates of King's Landing, unseating them and then burying them in rubble, in the form of her secret child, whose wolf is named Ghost. Olenna Tyrell proved herself a potent rival to Cersei. At one point, she points out that Cersei's not been the friend-making type and that she's surrounded by enemies, scoffing,
You gonna kill them all by yourself?
And that, exactly. By staging a highly public event where it seems that she gives fealty to the Sparrows who somehow managed to make us feel bad for Cersei. Oh, and then she blew up everyone with wildfire. Of course, she tragically misread how Tommen was gonna take it. The Starks and Winterfell specifically really pay a heavy cost to being the one part of Westeros that has their eyes on the bigger picture, which is to say the incoming years-long winter and with it, a group of magic ice zombies. Between the palace intrigue, marches to get the remaining Starks, and the zombie thing, Westeros was vulnerable, which ended up being taken by the Boltons before they're shoved back out. But they leave their mark, as invading powers tend to, taking the heads off the stone direwolves that stand guard at the castle. Early in the first season, it seems like Game of Thrones is a complicated game of who's your daddy. It's that mystery that gets Bran thrown from a tower. His secret also attracts an assassination attempt that involves a dagger that turns out to have belonged to Littlefinger, but he says that he gave it to Tyrion in an attempt to frame him. The dagger later ends up in Arya's hands, who eventually uses it to carry out the sentence on Littlefinger for, doing all of that. The Valyrian bladed knife also has a climactic role to play as well, when Arya drives it into the Night King, ending the White Walker issue. Even when all he does for most of the series is walk menacingly by the camera at the end of episodes to remind people that he's still a thing, the Night King actually has a full circle moment. The Night King turns out to be a creation of the Children of the Forest to deal with their encroaching First Man problem. Near one of their sacred weirwood, they turn a man into the Night King. When Arya drives that Valyrian knife into him, bringing that whole thing to a close, he's by the weirwood tree in Winterfell that they keep as a tribute to the old gods. Beheadings rarely work out for the people who are doing them, especially in narratives. For Joffrey, the rash decision to behead Ned Stark ends up mobilizing every Stark against him in their own way. Who would have thought? This ultimately makes him vulnerable. Cersei beheads translator and confidant and perhaps only friend to Daenerys, Missandei, thinking she had the upper hand, and she did not. Daenerys breaks bad and levels the city and makes a whole bunch of people who name their kids Daenerys suddenly have a lot of regret. Or, they were into it. I've never met one, but you never know. The Starks are a tradition-bound family, so naturally, they're the types to have an heirloom sword. In this case, the Valyrian steel sword, Ice. To really make a message of Ned's execution, they melted Ice down into Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper. Widow's Wail goes to Jaime to wield, and he gives Oathkeeper to Brienne of Tarth as a warrior that has earned his respect. They would end up going their separate ways and not always on the same side, but in the end, the two halves of Ice come back together as both Jaime and Brienne join the fight against the Night King, defending Winterfell. Jon Snow starts the series with a celibacy vow, so naturally he hooks up more than once. First with the wilding Ygritte. When they first get together in a cave, she suggests that they could stay there forever. Of course, he doesn't. and a bunch of horrible things happened and Ygritte dies. When he hooks up with Daenerys before knowing all of the things, they have to sneak into a cave because the dragons don't want to see anything happen to their mom. Understandable. In the cave, Daenerys gives the same suggestion. Of course, he doesn't, and a bunch of horrible things happen and he has to kill Daenerys. Next time someone says that, either break up with them right then or just stay in the cave. After spending 7 seasons being torn apart, everyone comes together to defend Winterfell from the slow marching army that finally made it to where the show was happening. Before the battle for Winterfell, Arya gives Sansa a dragonglass weapon and repeats the instructions that she received all those seasons ago.
Sticking with the pointy end.
We learned that the worst thing that you can do in Westeros is get married, even in secret. Joffrey being poisoned turned out to be nothing compared to the event dubbed the Red Wedding. There, it seems like the encroaching and seemingly potent Stark army is going to make a pleasant stop with an ally over a wedding. Instead, it's a brutal ambush that wipes out most of Stark's power. It was pretty shocking, but if we paid attention to the map showing the position of the Stark army and their supposed allies, you would have seen that they were not oriented with Stark, but surrounding him. The setup for the Red Wedding is Robb Stark going back on a betrothal for alliance's sake in order to get married for love's sake. Aw, love. It doesn't last, obviously, but it is a brief happy moment while we temporarily forget that Westeros hates joy. When Brienne records Jaime's final deeds in the big book of things knights did, the composer revisited that theme as a hint of what might have been between Brienne and Jaime. Despite the story's best effort, there is something that can pass for a happy ending in Game of Thrones. Sansa is Queen of Westeros, Arya is off to find what's west of Westeros, and Jon Snow is back at Castle Black. It's similar to the end of Season 4 that sees the surviving Starks having to set out on a newly adjusted adventure with Arya fleeing Westeros, Sansa making one of her many moves between the frying pan and the fire, and Jon doing Jon things. To drive that home, the music cue is the same. Without The Lord of the Rings, there probably would not be a Game of Thrones. Not just in the defining influence the classic series had on the fantasy genre in general, but also in the box office gold that the epic film series managed to be, mainstreaming the fantasy genre. In a little bit of a nod to that, and as a result of prop and set builders having a good sense of humor, Gandalf's prop sword, Glamdring, was one of the swords banged into the Iron Throne. One of the first images we see in the opening episode of Season 1 is a stag that's been killed by a direwolf that's also been killed. With the stag as the sigil of House Baratheon and the direwolf the sigil of House Stark, the show apparently could not have been more clearer about the fate of those heads of those families by the end of the first season. If you're one of those people that did really well in your geography classes, you might have noticed that the shape of Westeros kinda looks familiar, namely that it looks like Britain with Ireland flipped around on top of it. A lot of the drama of Westeros resembles the clashing clans of early Ireland and Britain, and they would use them both as locations for the series, so it's like a double nod. Just like the White Walkers did a whole lot of walking before they actually became a factor in the Game of Thrones, Daenerys did a whole lot of wandering around trying to accumulate the army that she needed to take Westeros while casually freeing people on the way and drafting them to her cause. Along with telling us what locations we're going to play in the episode, the opening credits would also give us the current location of Daenerys, even if she would not appear in the episode. One of the most charming aspects of Game of Thrones was, despite how grim the show was, with every character undercutting everyone else and trust being fleeting at best, the cast themselves seemed to get along extraordinarily well. Goofing around in an Instagram photo with Pedro Pascal, Heady covered the actor's eyes with her thumbs. This, it turns out, would be the way that the Mountain ends the Red Viper. Hitchcock may not have invented inserting himself into the movies he makes as a cameo, but he's the best known for it. Now, creator cameos are a fairly common thing. Showrunners Dan Weiss and David Benioff made not one but 2 appearances. They appear as wildling survivors after the Battle of Winterfell and also as one of the 2 faces in the Hall of Faces. The White Walkers did not do a lot of talking, sort of the benefit of a hive mind. But it's clear they weren't just mindlessly killing machines like your average zombies. There's also a bit of signaling about who the White Walkers want a piece of. In their final march towards Winterfell, in an overhead shot, they seem to be forming the sigil of House Stark, the Direwolf. There's a whole thing in filmmaking that the two most important shots of a movie are the first one and the last one. The best way to make that work is to make sure that they relate in some way. Game of Thrones starts with the gate through the wall to allow for a Night's Watch patrol to head out in search of wilding raiders, which ends in someone seeing something spooky and then get beheaded by Ned Stark for leaving his post. The show ends with Jon Snow and the new wildling allies opening the same gate to start a new era for Westeros. I'm kinda keen to find out what Arya Stark found to the west of Westeros, but the world is still waiting for that last book from Martin, and there's no point in putting more pressure on him. In his defense, he has been busy since his series became a cultural touchstone.